Hey guys, welcome back. Let's continue our conversation about the executive branch. Today we're going to be covering 12.4 and 12.5. 12.4 having to do with the president's role with legislative matters, and 12.5 having to do with the president's role on national security and more international policy stuff. So let's start with 12.4. First, it is the duty of the president to propose and the privilege of Congress to dispose. So essentially, what we're saying here, what this infamous FDR quote tells us, is that for really since FDR, it's been the role of the president to kind of be the hand on the steering wheel of the legislative agenda. Up until the 1930s, it really wasn't the role of the president to be such a integral or such a big part of the legislative process. He didn't have nearly as much input. Starting with FDR, that completely changes, particularly as a result of the Great Depression and FDR's New Deal. But ultimately, what we're learning, or what we're being told here, is that the president is going to throw out a million different ideas, a million different policy ideas, a ton of different legislative options, and then it's kind of up to Congress to decide what to chase, what to pursue, what to write bills about, what to adopt, and what to ignore. Again, I mentioned this earlier, FDR really changed the game when it comes to the role of the president in the legislative process. You see this every year during the State of the Union, right? You saw President Obama talking about his healthcare system, universal pre-K, tuition-free community college, so on and so forth. You've heard it with President Trump when he talks about his wall along our southern border. Ultimately, in most cases, it lands in the lap of the legislative branch, so in this case, Congress, to really push or move on those agenda items. Yes, the president has the option to use executive orders, but ultimately, those executive orders don't carry the same weight in some cases as a law passed by Congress would. One of the things that the president has, and kind of in his powers, or in his purview of the legislative process, is his ability to veto. Right. So if Congress passes a bill, both houses vote yes. The president has three options. The first is he can sign it. If he signs it, then obviously that bill becomes a law. If he vetoes it, that bill goes back to both houses of Congress, and it takes 2/3 of a vote in both the House and the Senate to override that veto, which is extremely rare. If the president does nothing, and just waits 10 days, the question becomes, is Congress in session? If the answer to that question is yes, if Congress is in session and the president doesn't sign the bill within 10 days, it becomes law anyway. If Congress is not in session at the end of that 10-day period, it's what's called pocket vetoing. So it's a pocket veto. Essentially, the president just puts it in his pocket and waits and runs out the clock. So if Congress passes a bill at the end of a legislative session, at the end of their time in Washington, and they push it to the president, and he knows that they're going to dismiss, that Congress won't be in session before the end of those 10 days, he doesn't have to do anything. And that is in essence what a pocket veto does. So if you're Congress and you've worked exceedingly hard through a difficult process to get both houses to agree and approve a bill, typically you want to make sure that Congress is going to be in session when it gets for 10 days after it gets to the president. You don't want to put in all of that work, all of that time, all of that effort and money, and then let the president just sit on it and run out the clock with a pocket veto. So it does essentially give the president of the United States the ability to keep Congress in session, to keep them from adjourning. But pocket vetoes haven't been as widely used in more modern times. As you see here, they were really something that excuse me, they were something that was used widely by Eisenhower, and then they kind of made a brief comeback with Reagan, but Obama never pocket vetoed anything, nor did George W. Bush before him. Clinton did it just one time prior to that. So pocket vetoes, while they are within the responsibilities and rights of the president when it comes to the legislative process, have not been a significantly used piece in more recent history. Another type of veto that you may have heard of is a line item veto. The line item veto power is not something that the president has. So a line item veto would allow the president to veto a part of the bill without vetoing the whole thing. The reason that we bring up line item vetoes is because it is a power that is held by state governors. They can veto a small section or just one portion of a bill without vetoing the whole thing. The president does not have the power of line item veto. He either vetoes the whole thing or he doesn't veto any part of it. Again, president does not have that power. Here's why, right? I mean, you don't want the president to have the line item veto power when it comes to things like the national budget. It's the biggest reason that we don't give the line item veto power to the president, right? Because if you get a Republican in office, obviously the parts of the budget that he's going to approve are going to be significantly different than if you get a Democrat in Congress. And we really don't want budgets to be that partisan when they're being signed. So for that reason, the line item veto is not something that belongs to the president. It only belongs to state governors. From a legislative standpoint, the president also serves as the party leader. He is the agenda setter. A lot of times he is a significant contributor as a fundraiser and campaigner for members of Congress, particularly during midterm elections. And you can see some relationships develop between the president of the United States and members of Congress in his own party. The president can do several things. I came up with three to create goodwill with congressional party members. He can campaign for them. He can fundraise for them. He can provide them other access or access maybe isn't the right word, but opportunities for visibility, right? I mean, if you're a congressman from Arizona and all of a sudden the president decides that he's going to make a trip to Arizona to help you campaign and you ride on Air Force One with the president, that's a pretty good opportunity for good publicity and good press for there to be a picture of you getting off of Air Force One at the same time as the president. So the three things he can do to create goodwill inside the party is he can campaign, he can help members campaign, he can help members fundraise, and then the third thing being that he can create these press opportunities or these moments of exposure for congressional party members. The idea of presidential coattails is something we've talked about already. It's the idea that we talked about it when we talked about the legislative branch, but it's the idea that members of Congress that are running for re-election or people that are running for election to Congress that are the same party as the president, in some cases will try to align themselves with the president to basically say, listen, if you like the president of the United States, you like the job he's doing, you like the things that he's fighting for, then you're going to like me too. The idea of presidential coattails and riding presidential coattails is maybe not as strong in some races as it is in others. Really has everything to do with how polarizing the president is and how polarized the district is, right? So, for instance, Jim Jordan, our representative in the House of Representatives in Congress, obviously, Minster tends to be a fairly red district, so he's probably going to lean on or rely on his relationship and his connection to the president more than he would if Minster was a little bit more up in the air. If it was a little more of a purple district, if it was a little bit less likely to vote for the Republican, he probably wouldn't link himself as closely to the president. But because his district tends to lean so heavily conservative, he tries to make sure that his voters are well aware that he is very much in line with and kind of in lockstep with the president's message, the president's agenda, so on and so forth. When it comes to midterm elections, the president's party tends to do fairly poorly. We have very few instances where the president's party gains seats in a midterm election. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, if you're running for president, say in 2008, which would have been right here between these two columns, President Obama is making campaign speeches, and in those campaign speeches, guess what? A lot of times candidates make promises. Well, 2 years into office, the president probably hasn't been able to cash in on any or some, I should say, of those promises, right? So people end up looking at the president and looking at the president's party and say, yeah, well, you promised to do X, Y, and Z, and you haven't done any of those things. How can I trust you moving forward? And as a result, Democrats lose a ton of seats in the 2010 midterms. The same is true if you go back all the way to the 1950s of almost every race. The real only outsiders on that would be the the second Clinton midterm. So Clinton wins election the first time in 1992. He loses seats in 1994. He gets reelected in 1996, and they actually gain seats in 1998. The other one, and probably the easiest example, or the most understandable example, is President George W. Bush wins election in 2000. In September of 2001, obviously, the 9/11 attacks happen. His approval rating goes sky high, and as a result, Republicans actually win seats in the 2002 midterm. But for the most part, the president's party loses seats in midterms. This is especially true if the president's approval rating is low, right? The lower the president's approval rating is, the more seats that the president's party tends to lose in a midterm election. So when the president's approval rating is low, you tend to see even worse results in that midterm election. Arlen Specter being a famous example of somebody that rode President Obama's coattails and lost his seat as a result. A popular president, however, on the other end of the spectrum, if the president's approval rating is exceedingly high, has a little bit more power or a little bit more influence when working with Congress, right? Because if the president's approval rating is up in the 65 or 70% range, you really don't want to be the congressman that's pushing back against that kind of popularity, right? So presidents really monitor their approval rating very closely because it does buy them some capital, or it does buy them some influence when working with Congress. On the polar opposite end of that spectrum, if you're a president with a low approval rating, it can create real problems for you establishing a legislative agenda or having any influence on the legislative process. It turns out if your approval rating is in the 30s or 40s, Congress is a little less willing to listen to your ideas or to listen to what you're asking for as far as bill creation and possibly crafting new pieces of policy and writing new laws moving forward. So the approval rating for a president has a really large impact on their level of influence with Congress and their ability to be a part of the legislative and policy-making process. An electoral mandate is something that really, we've covered it a little bit already when we talked about how elections work, but an electoral mandate is it's the perception that the voters strongly support the president and his policies. It can be an extremely powerful symbol in American politics, right? If you look at an electoral map post-election day and you see something like this, it tells us, well, man, there's an awful lot of red on that map, right? It does give President Trump a little bit of an electoral mandate in which he can say to Congress, listen, all of these different states, this vast majority of the country supports my agenda, supports my policies, supports my ideas. Now, it's a little less clear of a mandate for President Trump because he was not the winner in popular vote, right? If you go to an election, say 2012 or 2008, the previous two, where President Obama wins not only the electoral vote but also the popular vote, that mandate is a little clearer. But really, so much of an electoral mandate has to do with, listen, I won the White House, I won the election, and if you look at that map and see how much red there is, obviously the people think that my policies, my agenda, and some of the things that I'm pushing for are a good idea. It can force Congress's hand a little bit as far as giving the president, giving the executive branch some influence and some power on the legislative process. All right, moving into section 12.5, the president and his role with national security, foreign policy, so on and so forth. The president is first and foremost the chief diplomat of the United States. When we have heads of state from other countries come to visit, they are coming to visit the president because he is our chief diplomat. When it comes time for us to name different ambassadors to nations around the world, that is the responsibility of the president. Diplomatic recognition essentially means that you are the representative of a government in a foreign country. So when the president meets with the ambassador, in this case from Monaco, it is understood that she is representing the entire government of Monaco, the people of Monaco, so on and so forth, as part of those conversations. So the president's role as chief diplomat is probably one of his biggest roles as a driver of American foreign policy. Similarly, when the president travels abroad, he is representing American interests, much the same way that the ambassador I showed you in the previous slide was representing the interests of all of Monaco when talking to the president. The president is doing the same thing when he gives speeches across the globe. So in this particular case, you see the president speaking to a large group in Cuba. He is representing American interests. He's not only representing himself. Again, his role as a diplomat kind of entails those responsibilities. Cuba obviously being the example I just mentioned, but is a really good example of the president serving as a diplomat, as a international and foreign leader for the United States government. Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution allows the president to negotiate treaties. However, it is ultimately the responsibility of the legislative branch to approve them or to sign them, right? So it is a little bit of a check on executive power when it comes to treaties. That being said, treaties and executive agreements are very much a different cup of tea when you're talking about the role of the executive branch and the role of the president and the role of his cabinet in negotiating with other countries around the world. In this particular case, you see Secretary of State John Kerry shaking the hand of an Iranian leader. Because the United States had an executive agreement with Iran, frequently referred to thereafter as the Iran deal. That was not a treaty, right? Our negotiations with Iran, this so-called Iran deal, and the way that we were going to build a relationship and develop a relationship, and what level of involvement we were going to have in Iranian development moving forward, is an executive agreement. The issue with an executive agreement is that an executive agreement does not hold the weight of a treaty, in that it can be very easily revoked, right? So President Obama, with the assistance of Secretary of State John Kerry, signs this Iran deal, and as you are well aware, President Trump decided to remove the United States and end the Iran deal. Excuse me. But that is one of the chief differences between a treaty and an executive agreement, is that one is able to be revoked. A treaty, however, is not able to be revoked by the president. It would have to be, again, voted on or considered by the legislative branch. The president obviously also serves as the commander-in-chief of the United States military, right? So whether that means that we are engaged in a military conflict, a war with somebody around the world, whether that is a brief military conflict or the simple deployment and use of military resources, all of those ultimately flow through the executive branch. Typically, the president is going to lean on a team of military advisors, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which provides leadership from all branches of the United States military to provide the president with options, to provide the president with advice, and kind of lay out for him what the choices are that he's making. But it is ultimately the responsibility of the president to serve as the commander-in-chief of the United States military. One of the parts that goes hand in hand with being the commander-in-chief of the United States military is this little suitcase right here, this little package, so to speak, that is never too far away from the president when he is traveling outside of the White House. A lot of times you'll hear that little suitcase referred to as the nuclear football. Essentially, it gives the president the complete ability to launch a nuclear attack from anywhere in the world, right? So he has the nuclear launch codes. He has the ability and the authority, or I shouldn't say the authority, the ability and the autonomy to mobilize the United States' nuclear arsenal from anywhere. So if in this particular picture, President Reagan decided to visit Camp David for the weekend, the nuclear football goes with him. At any point, if the president were to leave the White House, in most cases, unless it's a trip somewhere in and around Washington, the nuclear football goes along. That way, the president is able to respond immediately if necessary. The War Powers Resolution Act is a little bit limiting in what the role of the executive branch is and what the role of the president is when it comes to military deployments, right? And the War Powers Resolution is passed in 1974. So really, the timing of the War Powers Resolution is the critical piece. Passed in 1974, it's a reaction to American fighting in Vietnam and Cambodia. It is not necessarily as influential in Vietnam and Cambodia, it is much more of a reaction after the fact, right? Because we never officially declare war in Vietnam. It is not recognized by Congress as an American war. It is simply a military engagement or a military deployment. For almost all of its existence, right, where the president is deploying soldiers, deploying assets and resources from the United States military to Vietnam to participate in this conflict between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. Ultimately, the War Powers Resolution of 1974 limits the authority of the president to send American troops into armed conflict or into really any situation where military force will be necessary without consulting Congress. So if the president sends military resources, sends soldiers into a conflict, basically those forces can stay there for 60 days. At the end of that 60-day window, Congress has two options. Either they can declare war or they can grant an extension. If they do neither of those things, the president, as commander-in-chief, is required to withdraw military forces from whatever the conflict is. So, in the case of Vietnam, if Congress gives an extension every 60 days or after the first 60 days for an extended period, the president is fine to keep military resources, soldiers, so on and so forth in Vietnam. If Congress decides to declare war, obviously that means that the military resources, soldiers, so on and so forth would stay in Vietnam as well. If they choose to do neither, the president would then be required to withdraw all military personnel from Vietnam. So it essentially eliminates the ability, or not eliminates, but limits the ability, I should say, of the president to have such a broad scope with his powers as commander-in-chief. The president oftentimes, as a national security, as part of his national security role, serves as a crisis manager. Maybe nobody more famously than George W. Bush after the September 11th attacks, which seems odd that the president all of a sudden takes on this role as crisis manager when, by the letter of the law and the Constitution, a lot of that mobilization, a lot of that work should be the responsibility of Congress. The reason it ends up landing in the president's lap most of the time is because, relatively speaking, the Congress moves exceptionally slow. Another significant reason that the title or the role of crisis manager lands on the president is because it is so much easier to take a picture or to give a speech when there's one person and one person only that we know we are looking to for guidance. When we are the current situation with the coronavirus pandemic is a perfect example. It is the president that is giving a press conference on an almost daily basis, because we are looking to one person and to one voice to be the manager of any potential crisis. If we let that fall in the lap of Congress, whether that be in a post 9/11 situation or in the current situation, whose voice are we listening to? Are we listening to the Speaker of the House, in this case, or today that would be Nancy Pelosi? Are we listening to the Senate Majority Leader? Today that would be Mitch McConnell? Are we listening to the president of the Senate? In this case, that would be Chuck Grassley. Like, who is the person? Who's the voice that we are listening to? Who is the hand on the wheel, so to speak? So for all of those reasons, the president has really adopted this role as crisis manager. And if you want the absolute best of President George W. Bush, this is the absolute best, the best of his time as president of the United States. The bullhorn speech that he gives post 9/11 and the first pitch that he throws out at Yankee Stadium, if those moments don't make you proud to be an American, boy, I don't know what to tell you, because they are absolutely the peak of the Bush presidency. Pictures like this, maybe not the peak, right? Maybe a little bit tone deaf that, yeah, we have a real crisis on our hands. We have a real situation here, and you're smiling with your dad fishing. But man, go back to this one, because it is absolutely, you'll be proud to be an American listening to that speech. These sorts of crises tend to have a very positive impact on a president's approval rating as well. And part of that is why he is so successful in that role of crisis manager. If you look at President Bush's approval rating pre 9/11, it's down in the low 50s, right? All of a sudden, post 9/11, it's up in the upper 80s, low 90s. Over time, obviously, it kind of regresses back to the mean. And then for President Bush, we invade Iraq, and well, again, we need the steady hand at the wheel. We need the one voice. His approval rating goes back up. Saddam Hussein is captured in late 2003. His approval rating spikes again because he comes across as the leader, the voice that we're all listening to, the deliverer of the message, and you just kind of see the way that these massive events impact the approval rating of the president, and you can see his role as crisis manager and how they impact approval ratings and ultimately the perception of the president. The president has the power of command. So the president has the authority in most cases, almost all cases, to direct our foreign policy or to direct our national security, right? He has the authority to say, hey, we're going to provide X amount of relief for people impacted by Hurricane Katrina. We're going to mobilize FEMA. We're going to mobilize the Red Cross. We're going to provide all of these resources, so on and so forth. And it really, again, because he's the voice, he has the power to command, or to the power to dictate or order, I should say, that level of response and that level of assistance. But as we've well established at this point, Congress holds the purse strings. The legislative branch holds the purse strings. And for that same reason, they have the power of supply. So yes, the president, after a natural disaster, something like Hurricane Katrina, can come on and say that he's going to mobilize FEMA, he's going to mobilize the Red Cross, we're going to provide millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of relief to families and citizens living in the affected area. But ultimately, it becomes Congress that's responsible for cutting that check, for providing those resources, for providing those supplies. It just isn't in the purview, or it isn't within the power of the president to do both. He can ask for it, and in many cases he asks for it very publicly to push Congress into authorizing it. But he only has the power to push for it or to ask for it. Ultimately, it lands with Congress to pay for it and to supply it. Congress, when it comes to domestic policy and national security, where are they more involved? They tend to be more involved on domestic policy. They tend to be a little bit less involved when it comes to national security, outside of some of the powers that we already talked about, having to do with treaties, the War Powers Resolution, and their ultimate powers of the purse strings when it comes to funding and paying for certain initiatives and requests from the President of the United States. So that gets us through most of 12.4 and 12.5. We'll be back tomorrow to continue talking about the executive branch, and we will continue plowing along through the rest of this week. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys soon.